Fallout Equestria the Chrysalis, Chapter 17. Goodbye. I've never been one for assigning intellect or personality to things that don't have those qualities. Such things are simple lies to make the unknown seem less misunderstood. Similarly, fate is a simple way of pretending that things all happen for a reason. That there's no such thing as misfortune or chance, merely actors living out a play. I've always found that level of self-deception to be incredibly unhealthy in the long run, but I knew enough of psychology to understand its reasoning. People like order. They like things to happen for a reason, preferably an intelligently driven reason. While in reality an event might be an extremely long chain of independent events all contributing to a single outcome, to the point where it can be incredibly hard or impossible to declare one single action to have been the one responsible for the ultimate outcome, it can be much more comfortable to decide some complex event happens because of a single entity or force of nature deciding it will happen. This becomes even more tempting when there are plainly existent entities who are actually capable of doing such things. The princesses Luna and Celestia were vastly powerful beings. Now they're revered as goddesses, and their influence is perceived, almost certainly incorrectly, in a great number of events. Ponies offer up pleas and prayers to these princesses turned goddesses and expect events to be altered in their favor. There are even a number of spirits out there who exert various degrees of influence over the world, and it is quite true that the events could be influenced by these entities. It's just the problem comes when individuals start seeing all events as being under their influence. It's a self-centered conceit, where individuals perceive themselves as somehow more important than the individual beside them, and therefore, what happens to them must also be more important. Realistically speaking, almost everything that happens is a natural result of the course of events, with no outside intelligence steering the results. There is no such thing as fate. But for a brief moment, I entertained that idea, that some malevolent entity had set its intentions upon me. It was just too much for me. I'd seen so many horrible things in such a brief span of time. My queen, a decayed and empty husk. The remains of my sisters, some still floating in the murk of their own decay. The vileness of raiders mutilating, raping, and killing ponies that should have been their kin. Another pony, one who should be a benevolent leader, instead selling out the ponies he was responsible for to those same raiders, all for a few pieces of metal. The whole way to my hive, I had tried to prepare myself for the worst. I had expected to either find a glowing crater where my hive had been, or a cold tomb for those had died centuries ago. I'd even learned about ghouls. I'd seen a pony ghoul just 2 days before, and yet I had refused to consider the possibility that such a thing could happen to my own kind. I must have pushed it away as a possibility too painful to consider. I allowed emotion to blind me to a threat, and left myself vulnerable as a result. But then, I'd encountered them, face to face, and impossible to deny. It was too much. So much in my desperation and horror, I imagined that some foul intellect had decided I hadn't suffered enough already. I imagined that it had animated the dead of my hive. Also, I would have to face down the corpses of my own sisters as they tried to kill me. All that was missing was a spoken accusation.
Why, you?
But it was all a lie. There was no malevolent force determined to make me miserable. The world didn't have it out for me. It wasn't even unfair. It simply was. Complaining about my misfortune, or just trying to seek out some imagined enemy was pointless. I had to deal with the situation I found myself in, rather than imagine some completely different problem. I'll admit, all of this is considerably more clear-minded than I was at the time. I was on the verge of breaking down. Maybe I did. I'm not entirely clear on what happened. I remember being pushed back and gunfire. The next clear memory was being held in Starlight's forelegs, my face buried in the soft fuzz of her neck, her coat damp with my tears. I pulled back, still wiping at my eyes. And Starlight stayed there, a hoof resting on my shoulder as I struggled to recover. I caught sight of Dusty and Sickle at the open blast door, though my gaze immediately dropped back to my own hooves. I couldn't meet their eyes. Starlight remained silent and supporting. In the background, I heard Dusty and Sickle exchange a few words. Sickle was spitting and griping about something, but I didn't catch what. The first words I clearly remember were Dusty's. "We should leave."
No.
I croaked, quickly wiping at my eyes again.
No. We came this far. We can't... I can't just leave now.
Starlight wore an expression of concern, but she helped me stand. I wobbled, but managed to keep my hooves. If I had been a bit more clear-minded, I might have worried over how weak I felt, even with the supportive emotions flowing from Starlight. The entrance to my hive was a scene of carnage. The choke point formed by the blast door was perfectly tailored for Sickle's abilities. She stood there, having deep breaths over the shattered remains of a terrible number of long, dead changelings. They were piled 3 or 4 deep around the entrance, crushed and mangled by her hooves and blades, and blending into a single gray, jagged mass in the monotone light. The broken shells leaked murky fluids, which filled the air with a powerful stench of rotten decay. The smell dug up horrible memories of my first day in the wasteland. A slight tremble passed through my legs before I could stop myself. Sickle was practically drenched in the fluids, dripping from her muzzle and chest. She grimaced and spit again, though strangely she went still and quiet when she saw me looking at her. I approached the scene with trepidation, stepping past the scattered shell casings from Dusty's rifle, and he stepped in front of me, looking as concerned as Starlight did. "Whisper. There's probably going to be more." I nodded, almost stumbling as I did so. I had to stop and steady myself, taking a deep breath, and it met with mixed results, given the nauseating scent in the air.
I know.
"And if we go in there," he continued, "we could get surrounded. If we're attacked from multiple directions, we'll need every gun."
I'll be fine,
I said, though I'm sure it wasn't a terribly convincing statement.
It was a shock. Unexpected. Surprises are more psychologically impacting. Now I have time to mentally process and prepare.
I swallowed.
I'll be fine.
He frowned at me for several seconds before speaking again, and my ears drooped. "You're not fine," he said. "I get that this is important to you, so I'm willing to go in there. But you're not in good shape. If I decide we're leaving, then we're leaving. No arguing. We can always come back later. You got it?" I nodded again.
Of course.
"We're also limited on supplies," he said. "I spent a lot of ammo keeping the ferals..." I winced. "From piling onto Sickle and weighing her down with her numbers. I know it's gonna be hard, but we need you contributing to the fight." Sickle grunted quietly, but said nothing.
I will,
I said. He continued to stare at me for a moment before nodding, though I could tell it was just with a great deal of reluctance. We entered the hive. I flew up and over the short wall of bodies, holding my breath as I went. I refused to watch as the others made their way across, their grunts as the crunching of broken exoskeletons was more than enough for me. I shuddered at the sound. The bodies trailed off rapidly past the entrance, the few who had been gunned down before piling into the melee. There was plenty of room to walk around them in the wide hallway. I tried to ignore the bodies and instead just focus on the hive itself. Apart from a few new bullet holes, it seemed that this part of it was in good condition. The concrete walls were cracked in a few places, leaving a bit of dust and debris scattered onto the floor, but the damage was minor. The maintenance panels spaced regularly along the floor were still in place, and the lights built into the ceiling, while dark, were intact. Even the paint, a cool gray, was almost entirely intact, with only a little chipping and peeling. Seeing the place lit only by the green light of the pip-up screen gave it an eerie appearance. And the subtle difference made the familiar space seem alien and sinister. It was wrong. I just shook off the feeling of unease, refocused on the task at hoof, and led us into the hive. The hallway split, leading into different places. I took the hall that led deeper into the hive, which immediately led into a wide atrium extending 2 stories both above and below the entrance. The open center stretched well outside the pitbuck's light, dark and cavernous. Balconies overlooked the open space, and above, massive arches of reinforced concrete crossed over the vaulted ceiling, the nearest 2 just barely within the light's glow. Beside me, Starlight let out a low whistle.
Wow. Except for being pitch black, this is a lot nicer than what I pictured.
I walked over to the edge of the balcony, hoofsteps echoing weakly across the empty space.
What were you expecting?
In the corner of my vision, I could see her ears droop low.
Well, you know, the whole bug thing, and you calling it a hive, so I don't know. I was thinking about bees, or ants, or...
She trailed off, scuffing a hoof against the floor.
Shit. Sorry.
I looked down from the balcony. Below, the courtyard was cloaked in shadows. Green light glinted softly off the water below the still fountains. Once, it had been a common area, dotted with changelings relaxing and socializing. Now, the only signs of this were a few misshapen lumps lying scattered across the benches, tables, and open spaces, barely visible in the gloom. I sighed. Then I blinked as Starlight's words finally connected.
Huh? Oh, no. Some hives were like that. Oh?
It's surprising how desperately hopeful a single word could sound.
Yeah,
I said, looking back to her.
The Chrysalis hive was ancient, and many of the new hives kept that aesthetic. It's tradition.
I gestured my muzzle out into the open space.
We were quite happy to distance ourselves from tradition. I suppose it was just mostly a symbolic gesture, but I guess sometimes that can be useful in itself.
Dusty and Starlight walked up to the edge of the balcony to look over the courtyard. The pitbuck's light spilled over the ground as she reached the edge, removing any uncertainty as to what the scattered shapes were. On my other side, Sickle spat a couple more times, stopping when I looked her way. It caught Dusty's attention too. "Something wrong over there?" Sickle snorted.
I had my mouth open when I squashed one of those fuckers. I can't get the fucking taste off my tongue.
She spat again, grimacing.
I hate fighting fucking ferals.
Starlight muttered.
Gee, how horrible this must be for you. Oh, get fucked, you little bitch,
Sickle said, baring her teeth before looking away from us. I turned away from the edge to follow the balcony around the atrium, and after a moment, the others followed. There was an awkward silence that followed. To my surprise, though, it was Sickle who spoke up first.
You know, you changelings are tougher than I thought. A couple of those ferals took blows that would have crushed a pony's skull, and they just shook it off.
Dusty and Starlight both groaned.
Sickle! What?
She shot back.
I was giving a compliment!
You're shit at giving compliments, Dusty said, shaking his head.
Yeah? Well, I don't do it every fucking often, now do I? Ass.
The heavy mechanical door we needed to use was shut, forcing us to spend a minute as I opened the emergency access panel beside it, engaging the manual override, and cranked the door open. As it started to open, another rattling cry echoed from the hallway beyond. I ignored it, focusing the entirety of my attention onto the crank. I remained focused, even as a scramble of hooves struck the door, flailing through the small gap that it opened, and moments later, the door was open enough for the dead changelings to squirm its way through the gap, only to be met by the carapace-shattering stomp of Sickle's hooves. Something cold, wet, and sticky splashed against my hind leg. I kept cranking until the door stood open enough for us to easily pass through, and we continued on. I just avoided looking down as I stepped over the shape onto the floor. The hallway led directly to the central hub, a series of high-vaulted chambers where the various residential areas met. On each floor, the connecting hallways opened into broad walkways that circled and crossed over the central open space, while huge support columns and arches reinforced the structure. Most changelings in the hive would pass through the space each day, so it was designed to be as pleasant as possible. The entire space in the center was a multi-level park, combining a natural stone underground aesthetic with a variety of surface plants. Water flowed from artificial springs, trickling and pouring down rock faces and along small streams to form crystal clear ponds. A soft, cool light filled the space like an eternal twilight, perfectly balanced for a changeling's natural eyes. Above, the roof of the chambers sloped steadily upwards to a peak high above. And then there were the other changelings. Always the other changelings, coming and going, flying and walking, attending to business or relaxing on their time off. Now that pleasant space lay dark, silent, and dead. As the most heavily traveled place in the hive, it would have been foolish of me to expect it to be unoccupied. A changeling ghoul stood only 30 feet from us as we entered, and with an angry cry, threw itself at us. Sickle caught its charge in her forehooves and smashed it to the ground with a sickening crunch. As more cries echoed through the grand chamber, we drew back to the connecting hallway. It reduced the angles we could be attacked from, but only just. It was a major path of traffic, and that meant it was built wide. Sickle stood in the middle, and we quickly arrayed on her flanks. Shadows danced as Starlight moved, casting the area into a confusing contrast of light and dark. The first ghoul came hurtling at us through the air, flying on tattered wings that shouldn't have supported it. An eye-searing flash of red tore out and half the ghoul vaporized in a cloud of embers, while the other half crashed to the ground. I quickly looked away as it tumbled to a stop, fairly certain that I had seen parts thrown about from the motion. Several seconds later, 2 more ghouls came running down the walkway, rasping and hissing. Another flash of red sent one to the ground.
That's fucking bright!
Sickle snarled as she stopped the other ghoul with a double hoof buck that sent the limp form flying into a supporting column. I stood to the side, floating my rifle before me as I tried to control my trembling. The trickle of dead grew quickly, scrambling and stumbling over each other. By then, a dozen or more were coming down the walkway. The faces of my sisters twisted into grotesque snarls of rage as they bore down on me, fangs bared and eyes full of hatred. They lunged, and I squeezed the trigger. My assault rifle chattered angrily, rattling in the grip of my magic as it spewed out bullets at a terrifying rate. The air filled with the head-pounding sound of gunfire in the tight space, the scene lit by the strobe of the muzzle flash. I don't know how much effect I had on the horde bearing down on us. I know the one I was looking at fell. Then the magazine ran empty, and I only got a moment of horrified realization before one of the ghouls, one of my fallen sisters, plowed into me. I staggered and almost fell from the jarring impact, my rifle clattering to the ground. A hoof slammed into my side, and suddenly I had a face full of angry changeling, her dead eyes staring into mine as her mouth opened, broken fangs lunging at my face. And something tugged at the inside of me. I might have screamed, I don't know. I know for sure that I pushed a surge of magic into my horn and blasted it into her face. I was free. Flashes of blue tore through the air, and another ghoul I hadn't seen fell beside me. I stepped back, my rifle floating up in front of me, and there were still ghouls everywhere. Sickle was roaring out, and nearby I saw Starlight firing away. I didn't know where Dusty was, somewhere on the other side of Sickle. I wasn't entirely sure what was happening. All I knew for sure was that none of the ghouls were attacking me at that precise moment. I focused, running step by step through the procedure Dusty had drilled on me just days earlier. Magazine release, remove magazine, retrieve magazine, insert firmly, pull, release, aim, squeeze. My rifle roared again, and I swept the muzzle across the line of bodies trying to get at us. One lunged at me, and I swung the rifle around, still firing, and put the last of the magazine into it. Another of my sisters fell at my hooves, dead for good. I reloaded and fired again. There was no grace or control to my fire. I simply pointed in the direction of the crowd and held down the trigger until the magazine ran empty. And then, I finished reloading and aimed to find there was nothing left to aim at. It was only with the sudden stillness that I realized how fast my heart was pounding, or how hard I was panting. Starlight was panting as well, turning to give me a very concerned look, which turned to relief when I gave her a weary nod in reply. My head felt slightly funny when I moved it, as the fog had descended on my thoughts. A deep crunch made me wince as Sickle stomped down on a still squirming ghoul, and then she looked back to me with a broad grin and a chuckle. Even past the buzzing in my ears, I could hear her rumbling voice clearly.
Hell yeah, Whisper. That's how you do it. Fuck them up.
I winced and looked away. Sickle let out a laugh.
Shit. Maybe we should have brought that minigun. Just turn you loose on all of them.
I could barely hear Starlight's reply between my own impaired hearing and her hushed tone.
Sickle, come on. Lay off. This is her family. No, it ain't.
Sickle shot back with a snort.
Her family died a long time ago.
She jabbed a leg blade into a corpse, cracking right through the shell.
These fuckers just look like them, that's all. Ain't like things are all what they look like when you bugs get involved, is it?
The last part was said directly to me. I glanced her way, saw the smug smile behind that gore-drenched muzzle, and looked away again. Starlight stepped up to my side, and I'm sure she cast Sickle a dirty look before speaking to me.
Whisper?
I sighed, then shook my head. My voice came out a little shaky, and off-tune in my ears.
Yeah. Changelings are well aware of that. What something looks like and what something is are two very different things.
I cast a glance back to the scattered corpses, and a shudder passed through me, but it faded away. The closest corpse was contorted where she had fallen, her eyes relaxed and expressionless, her limbs twisted at awkward angles, and of all the signs of injury scattered across her ancient body, the one thing that drew my attention was the jagged opening behind her shoulder, where a bullet had exited, tearing out a large hole from her carapace. I lifted a hoof and tenderly placed it atop her head, brushing gently beside her horn.
But we also know that a physical change doesn't change who someone is inside.
Starlight's hoof rested gently on my shoulder, comforting. Everyone was quiet, save for a rattle of metal as Sickle shrugged. When I finally moved, it was sudden enough to make Starlight jerk in surprise. I simply just crouched down, hooked a foreleg under my dead sister, and hefted her up.
Help me gather them,
I said as I dragged her towards the center of those loose clusters of bodies. While Sickle went to work without a question, Starlight hesitated a moment before her horn lit up to carry another body over. She cast a concerned look my way, which I pretended not to notice. Instead, I spoke as if unprompted.
The magical radiation killed my sisters and transformed their bodies into something monstrous. I won't leave them like this.
It took only a couple of minutes to gather the bodies. We remained undisturbed, no more ghouls appearing. And when it was complete, everyone stood back from the mound. Starlight was just starting to say something, likely asking what was next, when my horn lit up. I pushed a good amount of magic out and fire burst around the bottom of the heap so abruptly that she jumped back. Green fire quickly crawled up over the bodies, turning them into a raging pyre. Dusty and Starlight edged back, especially as the scent of burning meat and shell filled the air. Sickle remained sitting right next to me, staring silently into the flames.
I'll have to do this for the others,
I said, my voice quiet against the crackle of flames. How many were there in this hive? Dusty asked, and I shook my head.
Not all of them,
I said.
I'll come back when the future of my hive is certain, and I'll make sure that all of my fallen sisters receive their final transformation. For now, I'll at least give that freedom to those I come across.
There were nods all around, even from Sickle. The flames worked swiftly, light dancing across the chamber, and soon the flames faded, guttered, and died away, leaving only a thick scattering of ash in their wake. The light of Starlight's pitbuck seemed even weaker in the flames' wake. I stood.
We should move on.
They followed me as we continued on, following the walkway the length of the central hub. 3 times we paused by the still husk of a dead changeling who had died without being reanimated by the Balefire's magic. Each time, I bowed my head, lowering my horn close to them as I conjured more flames. As we were walking away from the third, Starlight moved in close beside me.
How's your magic doing? Do you have enough to keep that up? I'll manage,
I said, and gave her a weak smile that quickly faded again.
Don't worry. I have an important mission for the hive. I won't endanger that.
She nodded, though, judging by her frown, she wasn't entirely comforted by that answer. The multiple levels of walkways closed in, arcing down to merge into a single path that entered a wide tunnel. Every now and then, another small group of ghouls came running after us, 2 or 3 at a time, and Sickle and Starlight dispatched them with ease, letting Dusty and myself conserve our ammunition. The largest group came near the end of the tunnel, as the echoes of Starlight's lancer brought the attention of the ghouls gathering beyond. Again, the small trickle turned into a sudden flood of dead changelings. As the body of the group closed in, I once again fired off a magazine into one long burst, reloaded, and fired again. The powerful crack of Dusty's rifle and the brilliant red and blue flashes of Starlight's weapons filled the air as we formed a killing line. It was as if it had become routine already, as the horde melted before us, especially once Sickle met the charge. I'm not sure how many I accounted for. Only a few were still standing after my second magazine, and Sickle easily dispatched them. I finished reloading as I placed the empty magazine back into my pouch. I took inventory. The results were less than ideal.
I'm almost out of ammunition.
No shit. With how much you've been shooting, Dusty said, frowning across the carnage at me. How many mags you got left? I glanced down to my pouch, then back at him. My ears were already hanging low.
1.
He stared at me for an uncomfortable couple of seconds before speaking again. I do hope you mean 1 spare magazine, in addition to the one in your weapon.
Oh, yeah, yes.
He nodded slowly. Okay. So you know how your rifle selector switch has a semi-automatic position? I nodded. Use it. Rather than replying, I twisted the small switch, letting the soft click answer for me. Sickle snorted, already gathering the bodies up.
Well, shit. And here I was liking the whole changeling berserker thing. Whisper's more fun on full auto.
Well, Whisper's also almost out of ammo. If she wants to do the whole full auto thing, she needs to start carrying a lot more ammo. He cast a glance my way. Or better yet, learn to spend the ammo you do have better.
I'm not a good shot,
I meekly replied, occupying myself with the task of gathering the dead together. Volume of fire is a poor substitute for accuracy of aim, Dusty said. It's certainly got its uses, but you need to learn control first. I can teach you how to shoot when we're done here, maybe even teach you a bit about being a proper soldier.
Well, I don't need that.
Is what I intended to say. Well, I was an infiltrator. My tools were guile, deception, and stealth. I wasn't a combatant, but the last few weeks had put the lie to that idea. How many firefights had I gotten in? The same tools that had served me before were still my greatest strength, but things had changed. Appropriately, I had changed with them.
I think I'll have to take you up on that.
He nodded, satisfied. With another pyre quickly burning down behind us, we stepped into our next chamber. It towered as high as the previous chamber, but it wasn't the wide open space that one had been. A massive structure stood before us. In the dim light, we could only just make out the closest parts of it, including a couple of the great supporting arches that crossed above us between it and the outer wall. To either side of us, a plaza stretched out into the darkness, just a couple of feet lower than the walkway and dotted with more benches and pools. The broad walkway itself continued straight on to a set of great doors, standing wide open.
Wow,
Starlight murmured. Then, a little more clearly, she added,
your hive keeps getting more and more impressive. This is the spire,
I said.
This is where the queen lives and rules, and below it are where the changelings who help run the hive work. Down there is where we'll find the servers.
The spire loomed above us as we approached and entered through the main doors. Just inside, I started to turn to a side door, one which led into the back ways through the structure, but I halted myself. Instead, I turned back to the second set of main doors. I was about to open the doors when my ears were assaulted with the near-simultaneous sound of Starlight's yelp, a rattling hiss, and the near-deafening crack of the Lancer firing in an enclosed space, nearly blinding me with a red flash. I jerked to the side just as a black form crashed to the ground, and several more flashes of blue lit the chamber like a strobe light, ending where the dead changeling lit up blue, burning away under the repeater's assault. Starlight was already staggering back, her repeater sweeping drunkenly through the air above her as she babbled loudly.
Holy shit! What the shitting fuck shit! It was crawling down the wall! The fucking wall!
She panted hard as she spun, sweeping her repeater around again.
Oh.
I said, trying to calm my own breathing.
Yeah. What do you mean, yeah?
She snapped, stumbling around as she spun around again, searching the ceiling above us. The space was high enough that the rapidly bouncing light of her pipbuck left many dancing shadows above us as the blue embers died off.
It was just crawling down the wall at us! That was the creepiest thing I've ever seen!
Calm down, Dusty said, while Sickle snorted something more derisive.
It's okay,
I said.
Changelings can do that. What?!
She glanced my way several times, torn between searching the darkness above and looking at me.
What do you mean changelings can do that? You don't? Why don't you?
My cloak shifted back as I spread my wings, giving them a single flick.
Because I can fly?
Her gaze stopped on me, blinking.
Oh.
She looked back up, then slowly lowered her repeater. Finally, she let out a shaky sigh before turning to me.
You think you could have shared that little bit of information before now? You know, before I nearly pissed myself because some creepy wall-crawling bug zombie's trying to nibble on my ears?
She immediately stopped, placing a hoof over the bridge of her nose as she groaned, her ears laid back.
Sorry,
she said. I assume I had made some obvious reaction to her description of my deceased hive mate.
Sorry, that just scared the shit out of me. Pussy.
Sickle muttered. Starlight responded by lashing out with a forehoof, connecting solidly with Sickle's shoulder, and a loud clap of hoof on metal. The armored mare barely budged with the blow, and followed it up with a quiet huff of amusement.
It's okay,
I said, swallowing uncomfortably.
And I didn't mention it because, honestly, it just didn't seem important. Not important.
She let the question linger a moment before adding.
You didn't think it might be important, like, tactically or whatever, that these things can walk on walls. They can fly.
After a couple sputtered attempts to come up with a reply, Starlight finally sighed and sagged, a hoof returning to her face.
Fuck. My head hurts now.
Dusty stepped in. It still could have been useful information, but there's no point in dwelling on it now. Let's just move on. And Whisper, if you can think of anything else unusual about you guys, just let us know, okay?
I can't think of anything,
I said.
But, yeah, we should just move on.
I pushed on the door, and it opened a couple of inches before thumping against something and stopping. I pushed it a bit more, but it refused to budge. I placed both forehooves against it and shoved, feeling it shift another inch before stopping again. Defeated, I stepped away and looked back to Sickle. She was staring down at me with her head inclined slightly to the side, as if to say,
Really?
I gave an awkward smile.
Do you think you can get it open?
She responded with a short huff, then stepped past me. A crash of metal on metal filled the chamber as she slammed her shoulder against the door. jarring it a couple feet further open, then pushed. Her spike shoes scraped against the floor in a way that sent a shiver through my shell, but the sounds of clattering and grinding from the far side of the door soon rose over it as she forced the doors open. One final shove threw the door most of the way open. Most of the room beyond was in shadow, with Sickle blocking most of the light, but I could already see dozens of bodies lying just past the doors, as well as the broken remains of a couple of benches. A good number of both had been set against the doors to keep them shut. And Sickle stepped in, and I quickly followed. The room was mostly dark until Starlight passed the doors as well, her light spilling out across the room. I saw the dozens of desiccated corpses lying around us, some still clad in armor, but my attention was immediately drawn by a flash of green. I jerked, then froze, my eyes wide. The flash of light had been the Pipbuck's light reflecting off a facet of a giant crystal at the center of the room, standing taller than even Sickle. One face of it was badly cracked, with a few shards scattered around the floor. The floor itself was cracked and crushed in where it had fallen, forming a small and shallow crater. A rasping, clicking cry made me jerk back. One of the bodies near that crystal was a living ghoul, but my sudden sense of panic faded immediately. Her body ended with the crushed remains of what had been her hips. One foreleg lay twisted and shattered, the hoof missing entirely, while the other scraped at the floor, dragging her towards us a few inches at a time. Her face, lined with cracks, was twisted into an expression of rage, but I could only feel pity for her, crippled and trapped in this place for centuries. Sickle crushed her head under hoof, the good leg spasming and scraping against the floor a few more times before going still. I shuddered, turning my attention back to the giant crystal. While Sickle started gathering up the bodies, I simply stared. I jerked when Starlight brushed up against me, then let out another deep sigh as I slowly relaxed again. She spoke quietly, though still clearly audible in the quiet room.
What is it? A love crystal,
I said, voice almost choking.
We called it the heart, as in the heart of the hive. It hung here in the throne room, and it was always kept full of love, glowing with the energy inside it. It's never been dark.
She nodded silently. It was a few seconds before she asked.
Throne room?
I lifted my snout, gesturing behind the crystal. She leaned to the side, shifting her Pipbuck light to the simple throne at the back of the room. The giant tapestries that hung behind it on either side remained surprisingly intact, after all this time. I turned away, moving to help gather the bodies of my fallen hive mates. They were dry, empty husks, rather than a crude semblance of living than the ghouls had been. As I bent over the first one, clad in the armor of a soldier, I saw the injury that had killed him. A single neat hole, almost hidden below the front edge of the helm and right in between the eyes. A pistol lay on the ground before her. I slowly reached up, tenderly running a hoof along the side of her helm. Sickle grunted as she tossed a pair of husks onto the growing pile, and I could see both of them bore similar injuries. So did the others, whose faces I could see. I turned back to the body I stood over.
They killed themselves.
Dusty paused in dragging a body over. The radiation would have been deadly if it was strong enough to be turning them into ghouls.
Radiation poisoning is a nasty way to go,
Starlight said.
This way, well, at least it would be quick and painless.
I slowly nodded. I could appreciate the reasoning, at least. I drew my hoof back, ready to drag the dead soldier to join the others, but I hesitated. Slowly, my hoof returned to the side of her head. I sat, another hoof joining the first, and as gently as I could, I lifted her head and slid off the helm. Sitting back, I held the helmet before me, staring at its midnight blue surface. Starlight was watching me, curiously.
Whisper?
I huffed out a slow breath, turned the helm around, and slid it on. My horn and ears slid neatly through the gaps designed for them, and the helm came to rest flush against my carapace. as if it had been made just for me. I removed the rest of her armor, then shed my cloak and bags to don them myself. I slipped each piece on, slipping my wings through the gaps intended for them, and carefully tightened the straps until the segmented assembly fit snug and secure. Once it was all in place, it covered my body from chest to flank, leaving only the underside of my belly unprotected. A set of hoof boots completed the set, covering the sides of my hooves, while leaving the bottom exposed for grip. With the last pieces in place, I stood. The armor was surprisingly lightweight, and even more surprisingly, it didn't restrict my movements. I wasn't sure how much protection it might offer, given the light weight, but it had to be better than nothing. Starlight was nodding when I had finished turning around to test the flexibility.
It looks good on you. Thanks,
I said, though my feelings were a bit more mixed. I have to admit, the contrast of the dark blue on black was aesthetically pleasing. It was the significance of what it symbolized that concerned me. An infiltrator shouldn't need armor. A hollow thump interrupted my thoughts, followed by a moment later by Sickle's voice.
Well, that's the last of them.
I looked down to the dead soldier at my hooves. Sighing, I hooked a hoof under her chest, dragged it to join the dozens of others nearby, and I leaned her back against the heap, as if she were sitting. Then I stepped back, calling up my magic. Green flames erupted from the pile, rapidly consuming the dry husks. I stared into the flames for several seconds, before a loud crash of metal suddenly grabbed my full attention. The cold shock of adrenaline surged through my body as I bared my teeth and spun around, shouting in a loud snarl.
Get off of that!
Sickle was sprawled out across the throne in her typically lewd fashion, her head held at an odd angle as she looked back at me in what I assume was surprise. I took a step forward, wings flicking in agitation as I growled at her.
Get off! That is not yours! It was Ephemer's, and I'm not going to allow anyone but the Queen to sit there! Get off!
As I huffed and growled, heart pounding, Sickle stared back at me. She gave an amused huff, the corner of her mouth starting to rise, but her expression froze, and slowly, they lowered again, and after a couple of seconds, she nodded.
Kay.
With that, she casually slid off and walked away. Wow, that was a long and emotional one. But anyway, I'd like to give a big shout out to my absolutely magical donators. Yoshi Super Saiyan 2, Peter Coulthard, Nicholas Springthorpe, Dospo, David D. Sanchez, Dwight Cornel, Gagi, Secret Moon, ORIAN Pax KAIJU, Starlight Glimmer, Trey, Pokekiller Zach, Soul Dragon, Dak Britton, and Joe Piercy. Thank you all very much for watching this video, and I will see you all in the next one.